Hello students! In this video we're going to do an introduction to plants. First, what are plants? You've all seen plants before. They're everywhere. They're multicellular eukaryotic photosynthetic autotrophs. These are pretty easy. What are plants? Continue on. Some special features. All the plants have cell wall. They're made out of cellulose, which is a type of carbohydrate, which is different from the cell wall in fungi and bacteria and archaea. So these are, cell wall for plants, and they store carbohydrates as starch. So a lot of those carbohydrates are stored inside the vacuole of the plant cell. What do cells need to survive? What do plants need to survive? They need carbon dioxide right here. They need sunlight, obviously. They need water. Those are some of the most basic stuff. Obviously, plants also need nutrients from the soil. It also needs some minerals from the soil. But these three are the main parts. Sunlight, gas exchange is talking about how carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen go out during photosynthesis, and the opposite during cell respiration. And the last one is water and mineral. And usually the minerals are carried by water from the soil. Gas exchange. Gas exchange, again, requires carbon dioxide to carry out photosynthesis. Plants also release oxygen to the atmosphere. This is for photosynthesis. And there's also water and mineral. Water is required for photosynthesis, and minerals are essential for plant growth, just like we need some nutrients for our growth. Water and mineral are absorbed from the soil and is transported through diffusion or specialized plant tissues. So some plants do not really have, they all have tissues of all different kinds, but there are plants that are very short, such as mosses, that have to live close to water and the mineral because they don't have the vascular tissues that can actually transport water long distance. But then there are other plants, such as trees. They all have specialized plant tissues that can transport water and mineral for a much longer distance. Now, the next one is, what was the biggest challenge land plants faced? Land plants all evolved from water plants, plants that used to live in water, as we think. Back in the days, there were these green algae. We still have green algae nowadays, but we think there were species of green algae that were ancestors of all the land plants right now. So when they went from water to land, not being able to obtain enough water and not being able to, keep water long term was the most difficult part. So modern plants evolved from a common ancestor similar to the green algae nowadays, and then they used to live in fresh water. And then we can also see fossil spores, which in the old days, plants used to reproduce using spores, but it's different now. Most plants don't reproduce using spores. So when plants first occurred in water and depended on water for survival and reproduction, so when they came to live on land, not being able to have enough water or surviving and reproducing based on immediate surrounding water became a very big challenge for plants, and they had to evolve in order to survive and reproduce, and that's why we still have plants nowadays on land. So we did the biggest challenge of obtaining water. Let's continue on. There's also, being on land, there is the problem with heat and sunlight and reproduction without water. But heat and sunlight kind of makes sense. That's one we haven't talked about. So here we have another cladogram showing you the relationships between 4 different types of plants. They're not just 4 different types based on looks. Obviously, they do look different, but they also have different evolutionary relationships. So what you see right here, again, whenever you see a picture like this or a cladogram like this, you always want to draw a timeline first, going from ancient or past to recent or past to present. So you find the root of the tree, and this right here will be past, and these guys that are all lined up, that will be present. So you can draw an arrow upward showing past to present. And what you see right here is that there is a common ancestor at this node right here of all 4 different types of plants, and this right here will be the common ancestor of the seedless vascular plants, gymnosperm and angiosperm, and this common ancestor would be for gymnosperm and angiosperm only. And from a cladogram, you can also tell the different types of characteristics that evolve along the way of, of the evolution of these plants. So for example, this reproduction by spores was evolved before this common ancestor right here. So technically all 4 of these plants should be able to reproduce by spores. However, seeds also showed up right here before gymnosperm and angiosperm. So the result is gymnosperm and angiosperms reproduce by seeds rather than by spores. And non-vascular plants and seedless vascular plants, they all have the same mechanism as the ancestor, and they reproduce by spores. And then what you see right here is hardened vascular tissue. This characteristic evolved before this common ancestor of these 3 plants. So that means all 3 of these plants have hardened vascular tissues. And lastly, we'll talk about seeds already. And lastly, flowers evolved only on the little branch leading to angiosperms. So only flowers would have, only angiosperms would have flowers. All right, so here are, well, they gave you 5 groups right here because green algae, you can kind of count it as a group of plants, but not really. The main differences we're going to take a look at first. This is called bryophytes, so anything that doesn't have vascular tissue. When we saw these non-vascular plants right here, or these mosses and relatives, those are your bryophytes. So bryophytes lack vascular tissue. They don't have roots or xylem. They must live in moist environment. So, as you know, they live in moist environment. And a typical example will be mosses. What you see right here, the mosses are all really, really small because they can't transport water and nutrient long distance. They have to stay very close to the water and nutrients because they don't have vascular tissues. We call them bryophytes. Tracheophytes. The word trachea is kind of the windpipe of your throat. It allows the transport of something, right? It allows the transport of air. In terms of plant, the tracheophytes are any kind of plant that has a vascular tissue. So if you look right here, seedless vascular plant, gymnosperm and angiosperm, those are all tracheophytes. So tracheophytes, they evolved before the dinosaurs were there, or at least at the same time. So tracheophytes are vascular plants. It has transport tissues such as xylem and phloem, and we'll talk about that in a second. Includes seedless plants such as ferns. So those are the seedless vascular plants. They produce by spores. And then we also have plants that reproduce by seeds. Those are the gymnosperm and angiosperm. So if you kind of remember, this picture right here, you can tell the relationship between each one of them and some typical characteristics of each type of plants. So here are the 2 types of tracheophytes besides the seedless vascular plants. That's what I meant. So gymnosperm and angiosperm. Gymnosperm first. Those are cone-bearing plants. They're more resistant to wind, cold, and drought. So just think about these cone-bearing plants in winter, right? They're still living just fine in winter, and they have these leaves that can conserve water and resist the cold. Examples: conifers with needle-shaped leaves, Christmas trees. This is a picture of cherry blossoms that I took. Angiosperms are flowering plants, and very often flowering plants can not only produce seeds but also fruits around the seeds. So these plants, the seeds develop inside the ovaries of the flowers. Angiosperms can be divided into monocot and dicot. We'll talk more about that some other day. Here we have xylem and phloem. Xylem and phloem are the transport vessels or the vascular tissues of plants. Xylems transport water from roots to the rest of the plants because that's where water is from, right? And phloem transports food produced by photosynthesis to the rest of the plants. So that goes from the leaves on the top downward for the most part, but some of the roots of plants, actually a lot of roots of plants can also store the food, in case there's not enough food being produced in the leaves. For example, in the winter, there are a lot of plants that don't have leaves anymore, right? So they can't really do photosynthesis anymore. In this case, they still need to survive through the long winter. How do they do that? They use the food that was stored in the leaves, stored in the plant, in the roots for the most part, and along the tree trunk. Those are used during winters to still allow cell respiration. And then here's a very special thing about plants. They have dominant phases of either diploid phase or haploid phase, and they're not at the same time. So as human beings, throughout our entire life, most of our body would have diploid cells, and that's the way it is. For plants, for a life of a plant, it goes through phases of being dominantly diploid or dominantly haploid at other time of the year. So the sexual life cycle, these alternating phase of diploid phase and a haploid phase. The diploid phase is called sporophyte because that's the time where spores are being produced. So if you see, look at this picture right here, we have sporophyte going through meiosis and producing spores. So sporophyte is the spore producing phase. Gametophytes are the haploid adult plants. So as you can see right here, gametophyte, and I remember it as gametes are all haploids. The gametophyte is also the haploid dominant phase. And as you can see over here, for different types of plants, the amount of time the plant spends being a gametophyte versus being a sporophyte is different. Next is, I think this is the last one. Green algae. Green algae were the first plants. We talked about that. We still talk about it, but you know, science changes all the time. We learn more evidence, and this might not be true in 10, 30 years, or it might still be true and not so debatable a little while from now. They're mostly aquatic and they are found in fresh water, but the most important thing for you to remember is that algae is what we think, or the ancient algae at least, is what we think was the common ancestor of all land plants nowadays. All right, good luck for studying.